Okay, well, I'm not so sure that I'm familiar with all this technology, but so what's happening today is, as Mark has introduced it, because these are donors and friends, what we're going to do is at the end of Brian's presentation, we are going to speculate. In other words, we're going to have a conversation about what we think the relevance is and could be, okay? But I want to just say a few things first. And I want to point out that in 2019, we chartered the Russian ship to Professor Kaganovsky because they had an extensive experience, actually decades, of fishing for salmon and catching salmon and using those estimates to forecast the returns in Russia. And they're very good at it. And so we had the best vessel and crew to start off the expedition in 2019. And the point is that if salmon were present in the survey area in 2019, Professor Kaganovsky would catch some of them. You'll see the relevance of that shortly. The second point I want to make is that you will see, Brian will tell you what we caught and what we didn't catch. And I think what we didn't catch may be as relevant as what we did catch, and you'll see why that's important shortly. And then a final is that when Brian and I raised this money privately, we intentionally wanted to make sure that we had involvement of the industry. And in the 2020 expedition, that included the fishing industry in the United States. And again, you'll see why that's relevant. So those are my introductory comments. At the end of Brian's presentation, we will comment more on what we think we have learned from these two expeditions. So over to Brian.
All right, thanks, Dick. Well, after all our efforts in the high seas and everything else, I'm sitting in the dark in Nanaimo. So I'm going to have to ask for slides to be moved. I'm quite sure it's not all in Nanaimo, but it's certainly my local district here. I want to say thanks for everybody taking your time. These are probably welcome things to do. You're like me sitting at home half the time here. This will be an overview in the sense that we can't even really compare really detailed analyses because the data for this year is simply not available yet. COVID has certainly delayed ability to process the samples returned, but that'll have to be talked about in the future. So let's just start with slide 2 on the study objectives to remind people what this is all about. I just want to flag 2 principal issues in our mind. Number 1 is that certainly from my perspective, I see going out in the high seas as a logical extension of the research we've been doing in coastal waters for years. We need to get out to the bigger Pacific, but as you're going to see, it has its challenges. So the first objective we have really is that the hypothesis would be that the first winter at sea for a juvenile salmon is a primary determinant of the age class strength that's determined and that we subsequently see in our fisheries. All right, so this is the recruitment hypothesis. And the second one, though, is more fundamental or practical maybe, is that whether we can conduct research in the North Pacific, we use an international program, and really we want to see if we can measure the variation in salmon production and potentially to improve our forecasting of what we would expect to see back in subsequent fishing opportunities. We'll go to the next slide. So slide 3 is a picture of the vessel. This is the Pacific Legacy number 1. In mid-October, so well into the process, we learned that Russia would not be able to provide us the Professor Kaganovsky in 2020. And Dick seemed to phone Brian Mose on the first day, and over one copy, we ended up with a vessel that was not an oceanographic research vessel, so that took some effort. but I really have to thank Brian for his efforts to turn a processing trawler into a research vessel that performed admirably. And I also have to note that the fishing master, John Roche, he has lots of experience with some of us on the coast, and he was absolutely key to making this effort actually work out at sea. There is a note at the bottom of that slide about a reference deck at the end. I'll show you those last couple, and there just to provide you more detailed information about the two cruises, 2019 and 2020. I'll go to the fourth slide. I owe you an apology on the fourth slide because I discovered this morning that some of these web links don't work. They're the titles at the top, but they're not the links. So I'm going to send you all a revised copy of this deck. And the intention of this one slide was really just to give you the critical web links to go to see. NPS done a very nice job documenting the two cruises and some of the really interesting videos and so on. So you can certainly get lots of information at those web links once I give you the correct ones. And otherwise, there are two cruise reports that are much more detailed information about the actual cruises. And one is now published through NPAFC. That's the number 4. And number 3 comes up on that website. And it's right below the link when it comes up. It's the report of the 2020. And at the bottom are just contacts. If you don't get to answer all your questions in one day and 1 hour, certainly feel free to send a note to Dick or I. We can try and do that. Go to slide 5. I want to take a second here to acknowledge some absolutely critical people. At the top of the slide really is the Canadian and provincial government. Well, this is the British Columbia Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund. Many of you in Canada will certainly be aware of that by now, and in the U.S. it's a provincial and federal funding opportunity for Pacific salmon. They were the single largest donor for the 2020 cruise. That's $650,000 out of a total budget of $1.45 million. So provincial and federal government was huge, but we could not have proceeded if it wasn't for people like Brian with the vessel and John's capability. And notably for donors, I want to really thank Dan Nomura with Camp Fisco and the Pattison Group, because he introduced us to Chris Burrows with the Pacific Seafood Processors Alliance or Association, I guess it is, in Seattle, and Chris Spohr for the Seafood Processors Association of BC. Those 3 men were absolutely key in reaching out to many of the fishing industry in the United States and Canada. We have incorporated the logos for all of the donors here. And there were some individuals that I should highlight later, but I really, I also have to recognize the BC Salmon Farmers Association of BC. In 2019, they were a major donor, but they used a model that really was applicable to working in 2020. What they did is basically reached out to all the industries associated with the salmon farmers, and they all contributed something. That's the model that was applied this year, and it was critical in producing probably $325,000 to $350,000 of donations from many companies, and that. So, can't say enough in terms of thanking those men and the companies that donated. I'd also note this year that we had our first involvement with First Nation group. You see the recognition here for the Coastal First Nations and the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, and that. We even had a biologist on board with us from them, Tristan Blaine. And Tristan came along with drones that provided some of the videos that you've seen. And then I really have to also thank funders that have been involved both years, local foundations with the Sitka Foundation, that's really the Beatty family, and Eric Pattison and the Tula Foundation, and not just with resources there, with scientific capacity like Dr. Brian Hunt at UBC and Evgeny Pakimov at UBC as well. And last but not least, of course, is NPAFC through the IYS program for 2021. They provided a new net that we used at sea. It'll be used again next year. So let's go on to the cruise material now. I thought I'd start with this one of Jacob Lerner from UBC. On the first couple of days out, they went out immediately into a major storm. They got their sea legs very, very quickly, and that. But the crew of 12 performed just admirably. This is not a fun cruise. I think the best way to describe it is that you work 24 hours a day for 14 days straight, because we fished whenever we got on station, day or night. And the team did an enormous amount of work. And I'll show you some pictures later on to sort of emphasize some of that. But let's get into the material. So slide 7 is a composite of the survey area that we did in 2019, and that's the gray zone of the actual areas fished. It's more complicated in 2020. You'll see a set of lines, red in the bottom half, green to the upper half, because we planned, and we had to go into Prince Rupert halfway through for provisions. So we had planned a first leg and a second leg, and it was largely to replicate the stations used in 2019. Well, we did quite well on the outward leg, the first leg. We didn't do as well on the return leg for two real reasons. One, that when we came out from Prince Rupert, we encountered a major storm front that really prohibited the vessel from heading into the northwest. That then leads you to the blue dots on the figure that are not linked by a line, and that is really the stations we sampled on the return leg, the actual sampling stations. And I'll show you the second reason further on in the presentation, because as we went out, stations 3 and 4 at the bottom of your slide there, we had the highest salmon catches we've ever seen, 2 years of sampling, and very, very large catches that I'll show you now. We wanted to really get back there on the way back to see whether or not after about 2 weeks difference, so we would see a similar type of catch number for the salmon. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So these are the actual salmon catches along the cruise, and you'll see the legends on the side. They're similar, but they're not identical, and that in terms of magnitude. I included in 2020 the circle at the top. That was where we intended to go, but we do not have 2020 samples. I want to point out, though, that when you look at the outward leg at the bottom of the 2020 figure, there are two large black dots there. So we had very good catches down at the bottom. Just to give you some statistics on these, just how big they were. In stations 3 and 4, we caught 397 out of 566 fish. That's 70% of all the fish taken at those two stations. And for some species, it was even much higher than that. For pink salmon, it was actually 93% of all the pinks we saw in the entire survey. And that was really just at station 3. So the catches, when you look at them here, are very heterogeneous. They're not evenly distributed in any means. And that the next figure in 9, their distribution of salmon catches by trawl. I just put this together to really emphasize this point, and that in 2019, of 61 trawl samples, 49 out of 61 were less than 10 salmon in the trawl. So the majority of the effort, the vast majority of the effort, really is for relatively small catches. And in 2020, it was more extreme. We actually had almost 50% of the trawl samples had no salmon caught. Lots of other fish at times, but not salmon. And if you look at the 10% or less, like in 2019, it would be 85% in 2020. So if you consider that, our estimates based on Russian experience is that the catchability of these types of trawls is around 30 to 40%. We don't have a direct measure for the trawl that's been built or being pulled by the legacy. But if you use 30%, and with these catch rates, you see that the abundance of salmon in the ocean is not high. right? They're widely distributed, but not in big abundances, except when we seem to hit these patches. Let's go down to the next one. These are the actual numbers for you in Salmon Catch. I said in the text here that they were similar but different. The differences will come out when we see the sizes and the ages and so on of the fish. We did catch more pink salmon, which is a major surprise from in 2019. I mean, the rarity of pinks was very, very unexpected. So we caught more pinks in 2020, but only in a couple of sets. And that, so I wouldn't say that there was really a big change there at all. Chum still dominated. Coho was still a really good, interesting story in 2020. Fairly wide distribution of coho. And we caught one steelhead, and that was at station 8. If you look on the plot, that would determine where it was. But only one steelhead. Now, we caught more Chinook salmon, but really we caught very, very few Chinook salmon out in the open waters. We caught all of the Chinook salmon as we returned and began to be on the Canadian shelf again. So I don't even really consider the Chinook catch to really be open water catches. We'll go through the next one in slide 11 in great detail. These are in the cruise report. But you can see here that just looking at the distribution of the dots, the distribution of the species were quite different throughout the survey. I've already talked about pinks a bit. I won't touch on that one again. Chum was probably the most widely distributed, but still pretty heterogeneous. Sockeye is very interesting. Both in 2019 and 2020, we caught sockeye more in the northwestern portions of the survey areas, not in the south. Most of the catch is all above the 50-degree north latitude. And coho is fairly widely distributed, which again is an interesting observation. Before last year, I think most people felt coho were widely distributed along the coastal shelf, but not in the open Pacific. But in both years, we've caught coho quite readily. And very interesting DNA analysis from 2019. Coho that we caught were from a wide area of the north, it calls the North Pacific, Northeast Pacific, and a large portion of them actually from northern and central British Columbia. So you can look at those figures in more detail in the cruise report if you wish. I put in on slide 12 one example of the type of data you see in the cruise reports. I only did this to emphasize that if you have questions on these things, it's probably best to send them to us and we can provide more information. I think the chum is an interesting one. It's a larger sample size. And for example, in the lower left, where you have fork length versus weight, theoretically, this should be a nice, smooth, increasing curve. And you can see with the statistical fit, and just by eye, that you really do see a pretty substantial growth rate, but also very good samples that do show a curvilinear increase. And the other plots are more detailed expression of the distribution of length, or the catch by trawl, or the condition of the fish. Condition factors for salmon is the relationship of weight to length, and it should be around 1 is for this metric. But in 2019 for chum, we saw some very emaciated chum, very, very thin. Others were perfectly healthy, but some look very, very thin.
Hey, can anybody
see from the top right picture of that? You don't see that this year. We had
I
some
can hear
below
you.
1.
You have to stop Brian for a minute because he's not synchronized with the slides.
Yeah, Brian, it's Mark here. Laura, I don't know if your computers were back on the slide with the distribution by species.
So just
I see it working on my computer, so it's updated in my presenter view, and I think that the internet connection is just being slow because on the slide that is displaying to the audience, it's still the slide behind, so maybe it's just the internet being a bit slow.
So, and just so that everybody knows that Brian can't actually see the slides. So,
yeah.
Brian, the slide that's there now is the distribution. And then can you just switch to the next one?
Well, let's go down to slide 13, because I think that people will understand the slide 12. It's just an example directly from the reports. 13 should be the chum.
Yeah, we've got a slide showing right now, at least on mine, that says
Here, so it's-
example of figures, and then it's got all the chum figures, the
This is,
growth rate, etc.
Well, that should be slide 12. Go to 13.
So Saunders, tell everybody how this technology is working so well.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dick, or that observation. Yeah. Oh man, yeah.
I'm sure.
Okay, where are you there,
everybody-
Ruben?
We're still back on the figure 3 with the chum. So Laura, where's your machine sitting right now?
So right now it says that I'm, seeing figure 3 and it's not updating. So we might need to switch presenters here.
Okay, when you get the presenters, go to slide 13, North Pacific chum salmon caught.
There you go. This is
You
good.
good?
Yeah.
Okay. So keep going so we can get to our discussion.
Yeah.
I wanted to include this slide because I think it's a really interesting example of, I'm not sure everybody would have thought that the sample of chum we got in 2019 in that limited area of the North Pacific could actually include all the continents of origin that produce chum, including a significant portion coming down from the Yukon River. Probably not a surprise that the majority of the chum caught in 2019 were from the Alaskan sources, but we did have about 17% from BC and including another 4% from Washington State. That's so very interesting distribution. Chum obviously are quite very wide migrators across the North Pacific. The age structure of chum was one of the most interesting observations in 2019. While we've got good numbers of them, many of them were the immature and younger ages. And that was quite consistent with the terrible return of the older, mature chum along a lot of the coast of North America in 2019. We see a little bit better numbers in the age 4 and 5s in the 2020 samples, but I do have to emphasize that these agings are done with some quick readings on the boat as everybody's working. So I fully expect that many of these will change. These are definitely preliminary. But you still do see a large proportion, we got about 53% of age 1 and 2s, and compared to last year where we would have saw about 42% on that. So again, similar to, but different. All right, so now I've included a number of pictures here to give you a sense of just what happens. Now you're showing a PDF, so this is probably a problem. Slide 14, it probably looks like you've got a picture on top of a picture, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is unfortunate. It's part of the, so these are pictures from the big catch of salmon in set 3. The first picture underneath is a number of the crew. There are 7 or 8 of the crew handling all these fish. Remember, it's early in the program. We're really getting our feet wet, and they've been inundated with salmon. The picture on top was more an example of you can get a better sense of the size of the salmon in the trawl catch. These are not big, so these are probably in the 25 to 30 centimeter range. You might also notice that every one of them has a yellow tag on the tail and the caudal peduncle. And that goes on immediately, and then every sample taken from that fish is associated to that tag number. Let's go to slide 15. This is a picture of the sampling area. So there's the trawl deck. So when the trawl comes up on deck, there's going to be lots of baskets to sort all the fish out. And the Legacy is designed in such a way that you could bring the sample right into an open-ended lab like this. And Brian and staff did a wonderful job building these white tables for everybody to work at. And a lot of material is sorted out in this long table area. But it's totally exposed to the outside, so probably some interesting weather. Let's go down to the next one in 16. There are some really, really interesting fish that came up in this. I just chose a few examples to very quickly show you some of them. This is the Pacific sandfish, and the reason I picked this is it's not a big fish, but the jaws and the teeth on these are phenomenal. And so this little guy, now you can find these along our coastline, but the interesting thing is that most texts on sandfish say that they mix with juvenile salmon schools, right? So you kind of wonder if they're feeding with the salmon or feeding on the salmon with those teeth. And that slide 17, this to me is one of the most interesting beasts. So these are larval eels, wide and very clear. First time I saw them, I had no clue what these were. But that's what a baby eel looks like. And we go to slide 18. These are just some examples of things that we caught in the trawl. We did catch some larval rockfish, not a lot of them. We got some small dagger tooth, which is one of the few salmon predators that we actually observed on the salmon catches. And squid. Squid is without question one of the really, really interesting group of species. I think over the 2 surveys, we now have 18 or 19 species of squid that have been sampled on these cruises. And I think the last slide I want to show you here is just what we start with. There is a lot of work in bycatch. Now, I said that in many of the catches, we have very few salmon to process. We take a lot of samples out of any one salmon, but the real effort goes into sorting out all the bycatch. So the left figure is just an example of the diversity of squid that we would have piled up that would have to be sorted out. And the one on the right is from a night sample, because what happens is you get a lot of the small myctophids that are deep water fishes coming to the surface layers, and we have hundreds of myctophids to sort out on any of these single trawls. So lots of work to keep people busy. A couple of other examples of results. If we go to slide 20, these are the diet estimates by species. The only thing I want to point out here is that if you look at this, you'll see common trends really in the chum, the pink, and the sockeye. Some differences, but overall dominance by the deposits, the shrimps, and that. Whereas coho, very much predominant in cephalopods, the squids, about 90%, and then Chinook and steelhead. Well, steelhead is a single individual, so it's got euphausids and cephalopods or squids, and Chinook a little more mixed, but these are on the shelf. These are not in the open water. And just to show you on slide 21, what we're talking about here, you can get very high catches, a lot of abundance of these small euphausids or shrimp, and wide diversity of size and species for these squids. Fascinating group of animals out in the open water. Just a couple of slides to show you the oceanographic sampling we undertook. This was actually one of the major changes when you take a fishing vessel and turn it into an oceanographic sampling vessel. So Brian was great at providing an additional winch. We did the wiring and we had to sort out how to do this. But so the picture here, the one on the right is what's called a Niskin bottle. This would be taking water samples for water chemistry and for what we call environmental DNA samples. And the picture on the left is just an example of the bongos nets. These are used to sample zooplankton. And at each station, we would put this down to 250 meters and then bring it back up through the water column at 1 meter per second. And lot to catch. Now, this is one of the most interesting little beasts that I've ever seen. On slide 23, this is a Pacific viper fish. in the left-hand side, you see it's relatively small. This is just a jar containing the bongo net sample in this case. But on the right, this little fish is not your friend. Look at the teeth in that little guy. So it's not a nice environment out there for some animals. The next two slides are just only two examples of our environmental monitoring. The cruises in 2019 and 2020 were very, very similar in terms of surface water temperatures. 2020, was only slightly cooler on average, but the range was very similar. So in our northwest extreme, we got down to 5.5 degrees. If we had gone into the northern section of our cruise, I'm sure we would have got down to 5. And then in the south, up to 9 degrees. So very strong thermal change through the upper layer of water from the northern extent to the southern extent of our survey. And if you then actually look at the water content in terms of chlorophyll, and this is our measure of biological productivity, in that you see a very patchy distribution, but related to the temperatures that we monitored. It is interesting that the dark red cluster just off Vancouver Island, and it has 125 around it. That's exactly on top of where we caught the very large sample of salmon at station 3 and 4. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I just wanted to return to our objectives. What can we say about our initial ideas? Have we advanced the major hypothesis? I don't think there's any question that we have advanced this, but we can't make too many conclusions at this time because, as I started, we don't have all the data analyzed yet. That's to come. Can we improve the forecasting? I think Dick and I definitely believe that there's no question about this, but there is a reality after 2 years of single vessel surveys, and you're sampling literally millions of square kilometers of ocean, and with the very patchy distribution of catch that we've seen, it's a big, big challenge for single vessels. We need a more unified approach. And so that really leads us to the final box there. Next year's cruise is a very unique opportunity where the idea is to have 5 vessels working simultaneously across the Pacific. And that may be the type of effort that's required to really make progress. So that's the end of my presentation. I want to thank our science crew, some of which are with us today. And I want to thank Brian and John and all the donors. And I just point out that there were 3 final slides, and these just give you the details of the comparison between years, the vessels, the crews, the coverage, and so on. One point I realized that I missed for you is when you go back to the salmon catch, the Russians have worked out a way to calculate the total abundance of salmon within the cruise area. In the figure, you'll see that the estimate for 2020 is 51.3 million Pacific salmon, compared to 2019 was 55 million. But there are slight differences in the sampling area. So if you actually adjust for the area, you end up getting identical abundances of salmon between 2019 and 2020, which may not be a very good message to end with, because the 2019 abundance didn't generate a really productive salmon fisheries. So I wouldn't say that we're seeing a big recovery yet in salmon, but we're early on in these sorts of studies. So that's it. Again, thanks for your attention and interest, and hopefully we've left enough time for some discussion. To you, Mark.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that. So Stephanie's just putting up one slide, and I've got a couple of remarks about the 2021 cruise expedition that Brian mentioned. And while I'm doing that, if you could open your chat section, again on the upper right-hand side, you'll see a little dialog bubble, if you can open that up if you haven't already, and you'll see a place to enter your message. If you could put down, type in question if you've got a question, and then we'll call on you to unmute yourself and open your video, and you can ask questions, or you can type your questions in there directly. So we did have, we had a couple of functions like this before, and people seem to really hesitate to do that. So please, I encourage you to if you've got a question, feel free to ask one. The slide that Stephanie just put up there is the expedition that we're planning in 2021, and this effort of the International Year of the Salmon, Dick's idea originally to say we need to get back into the high seas and start to understand the mechanisms and bring information that we need to manage salmon. And this was sort of embraced by the 5 countries, Canada, United States, Japan, Korea, and Russia, that are part of the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. And Russia in particular suggested that we need a fully pan-Pacific survey, a group of concurrent surveys with up to 5 vessels covering zones. So we've been working, and I think this, of course, builds extremely well with the work that Dick and Brian have been doing, and all of you that have been lending support to. So having 3 sets of observations, 19, 20, and then hopefully 2021 in the Gulf of Alaska, giving us a much wider view, should give us what we need to sort of set the approach into the future for us to study these mechanisms that really right now have been having to be a source of speculation and a black box in terms of what's going on with our salmon and the decline in the marine environment. So we do have a group of scientists, including Dick and Brian, and representatives from all the countries. We have 5, we're chasing 5 vessels right now. We have a commitment for Zone 5 from a Canadian vessel, the Franklin, that has been allocated for 30 days next March, February, March, and we are waiting on the results of a request for the US vessel, the Shimada. The Russian vessel for Zone 1 has been confirmed, and we are seeking funding. We need about $3 million in funding for charters in zones 2 and 3. Right now, a second Russian vessel is available during that time slot next March, February, March, but we don't have the resources. We've got $300K through the BC SRIF, BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund, to support this, and actually that BC SRIF has provided close to $3 million over 3 years to support Canadian involvement of Canadian academics and others in this 2021 expedition. Our expectation is that these 3 years will give us what we need to really understand how this can work. People will recognize it costs a lot of money and effort to put a ship to sea. Some of the aspects that we're looking at are there other technologies that we can use to augment covering this huge these areas. And one proposal has been accepted with through the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service to provide 2 gliders. These are vehicles that will be underwater that are equipped with acoustic capability to detect fish. And so we'll be, and as well as oceanographic conditions. So those will augment the work, at the least in the Gulf of Alaska. So this is about trying to learn how we do this into the future, using both ships and others to start addressing these gaps in this really critical area that we're trying to understand. So looking for continuing and ongoing support to assist us with putting pressure on countries to provide resources, as well as funders that are prepared to work with us on trying to close the gap on making sure we get vessels in 2 and 3. So I'll leave it at that. We'll see. I see some questions
Mark,
starting.
I have a few comments, so before you take questions,
Sorry,
okay?
yeah, go ahead, Dick. Go ahead, yeah.
We said at the beginning that Brian and I would, and we called it speculation, that we would comment about the relevance of the two expeditions. And Brian has touched on this a little bit, but when we were looking at the 2019 expedition, I guess probably the word is imagined what we would catch. And our catches were much less than we imagined. We really had no basis for even thinking about what the catches would be. But what we caught, I guess it's fair to say it surprised us, and we weren't able to really interpret that until we saw the returns coastwide in 2019. And probably within British Columbia, the coastwide returns for sockeye, pink, and chum probably were the lowest in history. And the chum and pink in Southeast Alaska were also very low. So it probably is fair to say that the poor catches that we saw in 2019 were indicative of what came back in the fall. Now, remember that this is speculation. And so the catches that we had this expedition, 2020, do appear to be similar. So the speculation is, and Brian's already said this, that there is a possibility that certainly in British Columbia, the returns of pink chum and sockeye could be extremely low, perhaps another historic low. Now, this is speculation. If this turns out to be correct, then one of the hypotheses that we are testing is that the production, the abundance, is strongly influenced by what happens in the first months in the coastal areas. And you remember that that was one of the hypotheses that we're testing. We are testing that, making biological measurements, but just if you go back to my comments about the Russians and their use of the Professor Kaganovsky to give forecasts, it took a number of years for Russia to be able to relate their catches on the high seas to returns. And after doing that a few years, they were able to make the calibrations that allowed the catches on the high seas to be a very good forecast of what comes back. So the speculation is that the returns this year could be low, and the catches that we got this year, as Brian said, the calculation about 50 million, 52 million for the survey area, similar to last year, may be an indication that these high seas surveys do provide let's call it an early warning of what's coming back. I wanted to comment that we wanted to ensure that this is an international effort. Brian and I think those of us involved in the North Pacific and Ash Fish Commission, feel strongly that the way to solve the problems of understanding what regulates salmon abundance, the most effective and efficient way is to work as an international teams of researchers. And that's what we're trying to do within the International Year of the Salmon. And on both expeditions, we had international researchers or teams of international scientists. Now, for the 2020 expedition, we only had 12 bunks, but Russia did contribute 3 Russian scientists who actually were in Nanaimo for about 7 weeks. But as of a few days ago, they've all made it back home. So my final comment is that this is what we think is a way that we will eventually understand what the fundamental mechanisms are, meaning that we need to be out onto the high seas, that this information essentially gives us the bigger picture of what is regulating salmon, and doing this internationally gets us there faster and quicker. And I think those are my speculations. I don't know whether Brian has any additional comments.
No, let's go to questions.